We've got our special guest joining us right here in the studio, Professor Bibek Debroy from the Center for Policy Research, and Sanjeev Aga, former MD of Idea Cellular, corporate commentator. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us here. And of course, both of them, along with Swami, will be analysing all the poll trends and the implications of the likely verdict. Professor Debroy, let me kick this off with you. Market has already priced in an NDA government. What's the number that you think investors should be working with, beyond which we could see some sort of a rally kick in?
Well, I think the market has not yet factored in necessarily NDA majority. And if there is actually an NDA majority, I suspect we will see a rally.
And what do you think are the likely chances of that happening?
My likely numbers. Oh no, I think my likely numbers are the BJP 250, the NDA as it stands 290. So I do think we'll see a bit of a rally.
Mr. Aga, when you're waiting, the anticipation really builds up. But today, if there's any worry area, any scope for upsets, what are you looking at closely?
I'm not. I am not aligned to any one party, so nothing will upset me. But if you're asking me to sort of put myself into the shoes of financial markets, I slightly disagree with Bibek. I think markets are factoring in already an NDA majority, maybe around 280, 275, and BJP around 235 or 240. But even if you are factoring that in, there is always that 10%, 20% doubt that it may not happen. So if in fact it happens to that number, there would be a rally. And if it goes beyond that, which is my expectation, that the BJP may get to almost 250, which is similar to his, then I think there will be a slightly bigger rally. Whether there is basis for a rally is quite another matter.
And we're going to be talking about that in at great length today, about whether or not there is a basis for a rally. We'll see how the markets respond. Professor Debroy, sort of areas for upsets. What are you training your eyes on?
I am not really that concerned with the aggregate figure, because I am reasonably certain my aggregate figure is going to be more or less accurate. I would be much more interested in what the state level trends are, and I would be much more interested in some of the individual seats. There are probably around 40 seats where the margin will be less than 10,000. Those are the seats I am particularly interested in, and around 70 where the margins will be less than 25,000.
So give us a flavor of the seats that you're referring to, just a flavor.
Oh, several of them actually. Take Amritsar, for example. They don't necessarily have to be the highly visible ones, but Amritsar is one obvious example of that. And there are several such where one is talking about Congress ministers, incumbent ministers, with the possibility of actually losing.
But Professor, there aren't too many Congress ministers contesting in any case. The heavyweights
amongst the ones, the ones who are
but you spoke about. So is that a reason for some amount of nervousness, at least in the BJP camp, that a lot of their heavyweights are in tricky seats? Amritsar, like you said, someone who could be the next finance minister. It would be very embarrassing if a Jaitley were to lose. Even Lucknow, we understand, is likely to be a tough contest for Rajnath Singh, party president.
I think the only really tough one is Amritsar. I personally don't think Lucknow is all that tough. But if you're talking about the Congress, yes, several of them have opted out, but there is Jyotiraditya Scindia, which I think is very dicey. There is Sandeep Dixit, where I think Sandeep Dixit is going to lose. There is Kapil Sibal, of course. There is Ajay Maken. So despite a reluctance on the part of Congress ministers not to contest, there are quite a few heavyweights.
Let's bring the Swami on board as well, Johnson, from his residence. Swami, great to have you with us on the show. Swami, of course, will be joining us here in the studios in just a few hours from now. But just to kick things off, Swami, D-Day finally here. We heard Sanjeev Aga and Bibek Debroy both believe that it's likely to be a comfortable NDA victory. What's your sense? Do you think the final verdict is likely to be largely in line with what the exit polls suggest?
Exit polls have often been wrong in the past. I think it also needs to be said that the last 3 elections, the exit polls exaggerated the position of the BJP. The BJP on all 3 times ended up getting a little less than what the opinion polls had said. So yes, so while I would say the opinion polls have broadly given us probably an accurate picture, we have to leave some chance that they are wrong.
Swami, I know no one's talking about this scenario and the market is definitely not going to even be thinking on those lines. But in case, just in case, because like you said, exit polls have often got it wrong, in case the NDA falls short of the 272 mark, who are the allies they can potentially count on?
Candidates are Jayalalitha. Another obvious candidate would be Naveen Patnaik, both of whom seem willing. Jagan Mohan Reddy, if necessary, might be able to come in the case of Seemandhra. So these are some of the potential candidates.
So let's talk about the scenario that Swami just referred to, which is in case the NDA falls short of the 272 mark, who can they turn to for support? Do you want to add to that, Professor Debroy, in terms of likely allies that can emerge in the post-poll scenario?
Only to say I don't believe in that scenario.
Okay, but just for a second.
Just for a second, if you look at the assembly elections, which is the exit poll which has been the most accurate? It is today's Chanakya. That's the one which has been the most accurate in terms of the track record of exit poll. Sorry?
They're predicting what, some 350 seats?
I don't believe it, but they're predicting BJP 290, NDA 340. So if one is judging on the basis of the historical success of exit polls, we should be believing in today's Chanakya. The point, of course, being that I don't think it will come to that. So that is sort of idle speculation. It's like saying, hypothetically, it is possible that the Congress will get 400. Of course, there's a probability. Does one seriously believe it and discuss that?
On a serious note, you know, we've got time right now to speculate, because before the trends start coming in, this is not, you know, the same as speculating whether the Congress will get 400. So, for a moment, Professor Debroy, seriously, you know, is Jayalalitha a likely and possible option for an ally?
I will answer that question in my own way, which is that I am certain the BJD and the AIDMK will offer support to this government, but they will not be indispensable in the process of government formation.
But do you see the BJP reaching out to allies, even if they get the comfortable number? Because you know, we've heard comments coming in from leaders like Arun Jaitley that they'd want a lot of numbers on their side. Also because they will be in a minority in the Rajya Sabha, so they'd want 300 plus number in the Lok Sabha. Do you see the BJP reaching out to a Jayalalitha? Would they want to do business with a Jayalalitha?
Sandeep, with the caveat that I also, like Bibek, believe that this situation will not come to pass, but none of us know. And if it so happens that the NDA, let's say, just gets to 230 NDA, then compared to the hype which has been built up in the last 1 week, and particularly in the last 2-3 days, where for all practical purposes the party and the Prime Minister are already coronated, it is going to be a setback. Now this is the first upset, to answer your question. The second thing is that if they will still form the Prime Minister, I mean it will still be Mr. Modi who will form the Prime Minister. I think from the BJP's point of view, they will have a priority list of whom they would like to have, and that would not just be based on numerical strength, but also based on compatibility. And Mr. Vajpayee's government had a tough time managing Madam Jayalalitha, and so while that would be a big chunk, that may not be the topmost. That may really happen if they need it very badly. But if they can make do with parties at 10 or 20, that will be their preference, is my assessment. But I think, just to change your question a little bit, going back to upsets, we have been often talking of whether India will ever have a bipolar two central parties. And as much a question in this election is what is going to be the long-term nature of opposition. Is the Congress going to bounce back, or is it a pattern of terminal decline? And so while we might find the BJP coming up, we may have a little problem on the Congress. There are some question marks there.
Well, I know that Mr. Aga, Professor Debroy, you might shake your head in disbelief, but I'm going to ask Swami this question and then get your view on it. Swami, is there here at all a possibility, and I know we're speculating right now, but the possibility of an NDA government without Narendra Modi as the Prime Minister? How do you rate that possibility?
I would say there is today zero chance of the BJP forming a government without Modi. If by any chance they fall short and can't negotiate a deal, I think they would prefer to sit in the opposition, allow a fragile third front government to be formed, allow that to collapse in a year or so, and then try to win the next election. I think that's what they'll go for.
I'm sure both of you agree with Swami's view that there is a zero chance of an NDA government without Modi as a Prime Minister. But Professor Debroy, help us understand what has changed in the last month or so. Because, you know, a month back, people were talking about the possibility of maybe a Rajnath being a potential candidate if the NDA falls short. People were talking about the possibility that NDA could get to 20. There was a talk of of the 160 club, 180 club. And, you know, it is a known fact that there are many within the BJP who don't want Modi to be the Prime Minister.
I think I have three kinds of responses to that. Firstly, there is a view articulated by a section which may or may not have any relevance insofar as the ground realities are concerned. Initially, the BJP will not cross 140. Next, it will not cross 180. Next, it will not have Mr. Modi as a Prime Minister. Then the BJP will not cross 200. Then the BJP will not have allies. So this is really a time lag in terms of realization and failing to accept the fact that things had changed on the ground. And what was happening, and this is the second point, a structural change in terms of electoral outcomes. And the battle for votes was not so much the traditional areas of UP and Bihar, but the incremental seats that the BJP was likely and is likely to pick up in Jammu, in Orissa, in Tamil Nadu, in West Bengal and Assam. It is that, I think, which has led to these new numbers.
Okay, you know, we haven't touched upon how the numbers could look like for the Congress. You know, broadly, there is a belief that this could be the worst ever tally that the Congress party has ever seen. Do you want to put a number to it, Professor Debroy, and then Mr. Aga?
80.
80? As tough and brutal as that? 80, yes, Professor Debroy. Mr. Aga?
I'm between 70 and 80, unfortunately.
Okay.
The counting has begun. So as we speak, we've got flashes coming there from the Election Commission. The counting of votes begins for the general election. So it's 8 o'clock, 8:02 in fact, and the process has begun. So that's the official word coming in from the Election Commission. Professor Debroy, how much time is this entire exercise going to take? By when do you think we'll have some sort of a clear picture?
I think we'll begin to have a clear picture by about 11 in terms of trends. By 1 o'clock we will know for sure, and I think the final results will probably be about 4 or 5. You must remember that for some states there are going to be the assembly results also coming in.
You know, one area that we haven't touched upon, Mr. Aga, is really, we've talked about, you know, the number of seats that the NDA gets and the impact that that's going to have on the market today. But taking a slightly longer term view, the number of seats that the NDA gets, how is that going to determine and shape the economic policy of this government when it comes into power?
You know, my feeling is that the economic policy will not change if Narendra Modi is Prime Minister from what he has in mind, irrespective of his numerical strength, because unlike the UPA which suffered for this, I think he knows only too well that, you know, he has to deliver. He has a background of doing this in Gujarat, and he's not going to change his formula. So I don't think it's going to make a difference. The only thing which I feel is that market men believe that, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. But in the next 2-3 years, based on the economic policy as it actually manifests, you might find it is not necessary that everyone who succeeded in the last 10 years or did not succeed is necessarily going to go one way.
Let's ask that to Swami as well. Swami, do you believe that BJP's economic policy will vary depending on the number of seats it gets? So the more the seats, the more the reforms. Is that a fair assessment?
I think a lot of what Modi does will not be so much policy changes as better administration to produce better results out of existing policies. For instance, they had opposed the FDI policy in retail. The latest buzz is even there they will just tweak the system to make it better. Modi is not going to be a man in favor of privatizing the public sector undertakings. He wants to take them and make them more efficient. He wants to see clearances done quickly. He is not saying there should be no clearances. So I think, you know, if you really look in detail at policy, there is not all that much difference between the two sides. There are some differences, no doubt. Some differences, no doubt. For instance, Modi might do something far more concrete, shall we say, for recapitalizing the banks. He may say, we'll just go for a golden share and do it. whereas the Congress has dithered and finally actually done nothing to recapitalize the banks. There is some proposal for a modest additional amount in the current interim budget, but it will not be remotely enough given the Basel norms coming up. So I think he will be seen to be a much better administrator, a much better decision maker. But I don't expect that he will radically depart from the current economic path. There will be changes at the margin, yes.
I've got my own little opinion poll going here. So Professor Debroy, I'm posing exactly the same question to you. Will the number of seats that the NDA finally gets shape or mold the economic policy that the NDA government will set forth?
Well, you said NDA, but I would interpret that more as BJP. I think the number of seats the BJP gets determines not so much economic policy, where I tend to agree quite a bit with Swami, but it will determine the nature of cabinet. In terms of economic policy, there's always a continuity with whatever earlier governments have been doing, but where I think one will see an additional change in addition to the better implementation and better administration is in dealing with the states. You will have a far greater focus on decentralization and dialogue with states.
Is this irrational exuberance? Because at the end of the day, like we've been speaking for weeks now, Narendra Modi doesn't quite have a magic wand, or does he?
Nobody has a magic wand. A large number of investment banks, if you see their projections, they say that is the projection regardless of the election result, because the ability of somebody to turn the thing around in 9 months is limited. The biggest thing he can do is not measure A, measure B or measure C. Can you lift animal spirits? Can you change the mood? If suddenly consumers begin to consume, investors begin to invest and bureaucrats begin to pass files, that is not legislation. That is not policy. It merely means a system which had sort of sluggishly gone into torpor is suddenly released. If that happens, how much more will, I would still say you would be very lucky to cross 6.5 in the current year. Beyond that, we will have to see. I think Modi definitely will have some tailwinds. There is a global economy which is recovering. There are 600,000 crores worth of projects cleared and nothing has happened so far. I mean, some of those will surely begin to happen. So there are some tailwinds over and above. And if with the tailwinds plus animal spirits, he can change the atmosphere from 4.5, I think you could go up to 5.5 to 6. Beyond that, let us see how the policy the policy changes are.
Professor Debroy, do you agree? You know, there's room to go up to 5.5, maybe even a 6% growth, but really beyond that, it's up in the air.
I think one needs to remember that there's a timeline to this.
Yes.
If one is talking about this financial year, I would still say 5.5. I would not say 6, I would say 5.5. In terms of what this government is likely to do, I think there are two key elements to it. One of these is a bunch of things that are linked around fixing administration. This means PMO, this means cabinet, this means bureaucracy. It also means streamlining decision-making processes connected with land acquisition, forest clearance and environmental clearance. I'm not talking about changes in legislation, I'm talking about streamlining those. This also means that investments that are stuck in the pipeline get unclogged. This is the kind of thing that the CCI was supposed to do. It never got around to doing that. This thing will happen immediately. The second bit that will happen, but that's a process, is in terms of talking to the states. That's important not only for the tax reforms, it's important for various other things. And then you have the rest of the stuff, which I think will only happen in next financial year, because there is a lot of preparatory work that needs to be done.
But you know, even talking to the states, I mean, Mr. Aga, easier said than done. And from what you know of Narendra Modi's style of interaction and communication, is that achievable?
You know, I have a slightly different take. I agree with what my fellow panelists are saying, but I just want to add something. On the one hand, you contrast the executive incompetence of the top three of the UPA. It could not get worse. Whether you have Dr. Manmohan Singh or Rahul Gandhi or Sonia Gandhi, they were absolutely innocent about how large organizations like a country are run. And on the other hand, whatever may be his other deficiencies, this is what Narendra Modi is best at, how to wield power effectively to get results, to get outcomes. Now that's number one. Now let me just give you one or two small examples. Forget what you can't do. Take railways. If you bring in structural reforms in railways, railways is a gold mine. Railways alone can lift within a couple of years Indian GDP by 1%. And if you couple this with certain other infrastructure, healthcare, where there is no legislation, tourism, and I'm not talking so much of land acquisition, which you may have to actually hack through, but there are these low-hanging fruits. And I would be surprised if a person as astute as Narendra Modi hasn't already chalked out his plans. So you will find GDP will be propelled not in the first year, but from unsuspected sources, because let's get out of this mindset of GST and FDI in retail. There are many, many other opportunity areas.
Sure.
I don't think Arun would have a chance, because I think the finance minister would in effect be political number 2 in this kind of setup. And the political number 2 can't be Arun Shourie. It could be Sushma Swaraj, although Modi doesn't particularly like her at all.
I would actually interpret this kind of differently. I think this mandate is overwhelmingly a mandate for Narendra Modi, and it essentially means that he picks whoever he wants. If he wants Arun Jaitley to be his finance minister, and there are indications,
That's what will happen.
That's what's going to happen. This is not going to be enough to impede Arun Jaitley's ascent to that job, particularly since that his value in to the party and his stature in the party is so great and has been there for so long, and he has clearly backed Modi. Out of the senior leadership, he's the one who backed Modi from the start. So if you were to pick between Sushma Swaraj winning Vidisha and Arun Jaitley losing Amritsar, but who's more likely to be finance minister, I would still say that it's Arun Jaitley by a large margin.
Professor Debroy.
On this, I presume we are just talking about finance. But
That's right.
Well, we can go beyond finance, but finance
but
first.
before that, I think the structure of this cabinet is going to change, because it will essentially be, if it is at the level of cabinet and not ministers of state with independent charge, it will be a much slimmer cabinet. And to endorse what Mr. Godrej also said, there is a dearth of talent. Given that for finance, and let's remember Mr. Jaitley is a Rajya Sabha MP as of today. It's not that he has to be inducted. So therefore, I'd go along with Sadanand and say Mr. Jaitley is certain to be the finance minister.
Swami doesn't agree.
No, I think you have to give up a Rajya Sabha seat to fight the election. He's not there anymore.
No, I think he is there.
To the best of my knowledge, you have to resign.
We will, in any case, know in a few days. But Professor Debroy, I know you also believe that that Narendra Modi is likely to integrate various infrastructure ministries. We could have an energy minister, high-profile ministry like an energy minister, and some of the ministries like petroleum, power could get integrated. Do you see that happening?
I see that happening, and I can see some other people who will be in the cabinet. The portfolios presumably have not yet been determined. But I do see Mr. Shourie there. I do see Suresh Prabhu there. I actually do see Sushma Swaraj also there, if for nothing else, from the point of view of giving a signal.
Okay. Mr. Godrej, quick word from you. Do you believe it's a good idea to have an integrated energy minister instead of having a power minister, a petroleum minister? Do you think it's a good idea? Would industry welcome the idea of having an energy minister, maybe an infrastructure minister, so to say?
I think not just energy, I think a lot of areas need to be integrated. We have far too many ministries. If you look at industry, there are 6 or 7 different areas. If you look at even things like urban development, there are 2 ministries. So I think now that there is a very strong majority government coming up, I think they can cut down the number of ministries, make them more efficient, and I'm sure that will take place.
One quick point here. If this verdict had not been this decisive, then you could have argued that there's wiggle room, he could make excuses. Is he going to, would the government focus on administrative efficiency, not have the mandate for bold reform? With these kinds of numbers, I think the expectations are going to be very high. It'll be very interesting to see what they do in the first 3 months.
As journalists, we have the advantage of playing both sides. And here, Sandeep and I have been wondering privately about what the nature and health of the opposition is going to be like. One is to have a decisive mandate. One is to also have a healthy opposition. Based on the, even the regional results that are coming in, Mr. Aga, some of the numbers here are quite interesting. You've got the BSP at the last time we checked, with just 1 seat. A bunch of other regional parties that we expected to do better, like the left, not faring well at all. take stock of just a healthy, strong opposition scenario in this government?
Yeah, Manvi, just allow me to come to your question after I had something in mind about the earlier question. It's not just energy, but it's also primarily transport, where you have inland water, you have air transport, you've got railways, you have road, and all these interface. And there is requirement to take an integrated view instead of competing and sometimes destroying each other. In fact, ecology and environment somewhere gets embedded along with the land acquisition. But we have discussed these things. I'm not sure whether that change of having one minister can be done so fast. It requires a bit of homework. But I'm sure this should be something which should engage Mr. Modi as the next Prime Minister. But now coming to a more important or more interesting political point, which is what is happening, I think you just have to get used to many new faces. And some of the faces who've been part of our political consciousness for decades, you might find some of them and their parties might fade away. Mr. Karunanidhi, who has dominated Tamil Nadu as one of the poles, I don't know what will happen to him and what will happen to his party. BSP, whether they can bounce back after being reduced to one seat. There was a time when they were expanding beyond UP. Now they are down to one seat in UP. Can they bounce back? What has happened to the backward and the SC/ST vote is something which only an analysis will tell us. Similarly, NCP in Maharashtra, and that Mr. Sharad Pawar, who's been around for 40, 50 years, is such an important politician. He's not getting younger. What happens to him? So there are a whole lot of questions, including the Ram Manohar Lohia legacy of Janata Dal United.
Right, we're also joined by Mr. N.K. Singh, a member of the BJP and someone who understands economic affairs quite a bit. Comes in live for the discussion as well. Mr. Singh, thank you for joining us here at ET Now. Firstly, I'm sure you'd be thrilled at the verdict that we've seen come out. A clear mandate for the BJP and for the NDA, and looks like the BJP itself will cross the 272 mark.
Pardon? Was that the question to me?
That's right, Mr. Singh.
Well, I think that this augurs very well. This is completely consistent with the ground feel and opinion which we had, which has really now reflected itself on these outcomes, far better than any opinion poll or any exit poll could capture. And it augurs well for a strong and stable India, where I think that the leadership will not now be buffeted around by the compulsions of coalition politics and be able to take decisive steps which can catapult our growth, revive expectations, get the green shoots of investment going. So I think that this is a happy point, inflection point in India's economic history, where once again, after a long time, you will have a decisive leadership and a government strong enough to be able to take decisions which are needed to get to an 8% rate of growth.
Mr. Singh, I'd like to introduce you to Sadanand Dhume, who is a columnist with the Wall Street Journal. He has a question for you this afternoon.
Mr. Singh, I have a question. Now, you said that this government will be in a position to take India back to 8% growth. What decisions specifically do you think that the BJP-led government will be in a position to take with this strong mandate that it may not have been able to take had it been, say, 20, 30 seats short of this?
Well, let me begin by mentioning 3 or 4. First and foremost, I think that to overcome the paralysis of the executive, by that I mean that it's now more or less well known that projects worth over 6 to 7 lakh crores are stuck in the implementation phase for one approval or the other, or one hurdle or the other. Getting these projects off the ground means empowering the executive, which means being able to invest the senior decision-making process in the executive, that bona fide decisions will be encouraged, that they will be fully protected, and that they need not fear from multiple sources and multiple kinds. So I think that empowering the executive, in my view, is the strongest low-hanging fruit which can make a decisive difference in the overall milieu. Second, I think to send a strong signal to investors, domestic and foreign, that retrospective changes in taxes would be a nightmare which would never be repeated, that tax policy is
would be long-term and stable, they would be investor-friendly, and that the overall matrix in which we get macroeconomic stability in terms of managing fiscal deficits more credibly, managing current account deficits more credibly, those are priority concerns which the government would address immediately and of course in the first budget which it presents. Third, getting the matrix of center-state relations to genuinely foster cooperative federalism and to genuinely make for solutions which would have the states, I mean the federal states, as participating actors along with the central government. Mr. Modi has emphasized this repeatedly, that he believes that the autonomy of the states in terms of financial devolution, in terms of decision-making process, is something which is consistent with our constitution and which we must do. Fourth, and not the least, that some important legislations which are path-breaking legislations which have been hanging around for a long time, the GST, the direct tax code, and some other important changes which are necessary must be legislated upon even during the first few months of this government. It also means that many of the entitlement-driven laws which have really handicapped any sensible expenditure planning would not necessarily be scrapped. Repealing an act is even more difficult than enacting one, but that the implementation of those laws, particularly implementation of laws which, for instance, make acquisition of any land impossible, which, for instance, misalign wages with productivity, which has made India an increasingly uncompetitive market, those would need to be fundamentally rethought of. So I think that in my view,
just a quick follow-up.
Adding up all these factors, in my view, can reverse expectations, can invest optimism, and in my view, reverse the kind of milieu, create a milieu which promotes and fosters growth and investments.
Just a quick follow-up. Are you suggesting then that the core of what this government can achieve would more or less be the same whether it was 280 seats or 320, but the odds of achieving that have been increased by the weight of this mandate? Or are you suggesting that there are things that you can imagine doing with 320 seats that perhaps you could not imagine doing with 275?
Well, let's put it this way to you, that if governments are tantalizingly kept on their toes of whether a bill would pass or not, then those are not governments from whom you can expect decisive outcomes. And that if you really have the kind of depth which this government and which we will have now, will enable the leadership to think of legislations and to think of decisions which they would have been thoroughly cramped by the compulsions of coalition politics. I mean, after all, it is not no dark secret that Dr. Manmohan Singh, who had been responsible for the far-reaching economic reforms of 1991, no doubt under the leadership of Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, who gave him all the support which the Prime Minister could lend, in spite of all that, in the UPA 1, he was hamstrung because of what the left parties did not want. And in UPA 2 was hamstrung by some coalition partner not wanting railway reforms, somebody not wanting reform of the GST, somebody else wanting a different kind of reform. Those were the compulsions of coalition politics in which sometimes very sensible action was stymied. I mean, think of a scenario where one railway minister presents a budget, that railway minister is replaced within 4 days of the presentation of that railway budget, and that railway budget is substituted by another railway budget which is significantly different than some of the measures which were enacted. I mean, these were the compulsions of coalition politics. I mean, if you have a number of over 300, then you need to get on with the decision making.
Right.
You need to get on with the implementation.
Mr. Singh, Mr. Singh, if I can interrupt you, let's get a view from industry as well. We've got Mr. Adi Godrej listening patiently as well, and I'm sure he'll be pretty delighted to hear the economic roadmap that you have articulated. Mr. Godrej, GST, I heard Mr. N.K. Singh articulate GST, and I know you for one have been batting for GST for years now, talking about the need for GST. But let's face reality, it was the BJP and state governments of the BJP that opposed GST for a lot of these years. Do you see political polarization coming in the way of GST, or do you think the Congress and BJP will collaborate to implement GST in the next 12 months?
Well, I think the NDA now is strong enough to bring in GST, get it done. Earlier the problem was the alignment with the states was very slow, very poor. I think the NDA could do that very quickly. Congress, having championed GST very recently, will have great difficulty opposing it. So I am hoping that the NDA will bring in the GST legislation as early as possible. As you know, once we pass the GST, from the very next day, you will have an increase in GDP growth of about 2%, other things being equal. So I think it's a great reform process which needs to be implemented early and to get to that 8% growth rate at an early date.
Mr. Godrej, thanks very much for joining us today. It's always great to have your insights here on ET Now. Good talking to you today. Sandeep?
Absolutely, Manvi. We've got Mr. R. Seshasayee as well, Vice Chairman of Ashok Leyland, joining in with a quick perspective. Mr. Seshasayee, I'm sure you heard comments there from N.K. Singh and, of course, Adi Godrej welcoming the economic roadmap that's been laid out. But help us understand, at the end of the day, the expectations are high. There's too much of hope. We've seen the market reaction also today, and there seems to be this irrational exuberance. Are you afraid that we could be in for a bit of a disappointment 6 months down the line?
Well, I don't know whether we can at this stage talk about what will happen 6 months down the line, but clearly sentiments do have a tendency to move to the extremes, swing to the extremes. Therefore, I think we might see some correction to the sentiment. Of course, it's understandable, it's very legitimate that there is so much of buoyant sentiment. But I think we have to wait for the budget, which is the next major milestone in terms of policy making by this new government. And I do believe that this budget has to be pretty tough, because it has to address the issues of fiscal deficit, and this is the best time to take unpopular decisions like cutting down subsidies, ensuring that you rein in the expenditure, all of that, which would normally be very difficult to do. But now with this kind of sentiment buoyancy, it's much better to do it. And I'm sure this government, given the strength that it has, will do it, and that will certainly have an impact on the sentiment, and therefore there could be some correction post the budget. I won't rule that out. But I think Mr. Modi has been a great communicator. I think he's been a phenomenal communicator. And we have seen in history that leaders have been able to take tough decisions, very painful decisions, social decisions, which are very, very painful, only because they've been able to carry the crowd with the conviction and with the communication which is effective. So I hope he does that. I hope this government is able to carry on this tough decision-making process without too much of a dent on this very balloony sentiment that we see today.
Well, you've actually put a very interesting proposition out there, Mr. Seshasayee, and I'm going to get Swami and Professor Debroy's comments on that. The likelihood of a tough budget, and when we say tough, means really taking a tough stand on some of the subsidies. Swami, how would you rate the likelihood of that happening?
50-50. Very often it's worth saying that in my first 3 months, let me not be too tough. After that, I'll do it. There is a tendency to say the first budget, not tough. Second budget can be really tough, and the second budget is not a full year off. It's more like
9 months away.
9 months off. So I would not be surprised if all the toughness was not in this budget, and it was shared between the first and the second budgets.
Professor
in particular, Mr. Seshasayee, I mean, at this particular point of view, you being in the bus business, would you really appreciate it if the price of diesel went up by 5 rupees? It's very necessary, I agree.
I can't answer this as a bus driver. I think it's important that if there is going to be some correction to be done at the macro level, and some painful or some bitter pills have to be taken, the bus driver has to take the bitter pills as well. So I don't think we can shy away from that, Mr. Aiyer. I think this is the whole point about the short-term pain, and this is what I'm saying. Some of the communicator has to make it happen.
Professor Debroy, just the same question to you. The likelihood of a tough stand coming through in this budget, though Swami's point is interesting as well. He's got a short time lag between the first and the second budget, so he's got room to make that, the second one, the tougher one.
Well, at one level, I disagree with both of these gentlemen. And as a preface to this, I'd say that, look, this budget is going to be in July. This government has had very little time to make the preparatory work, including things like correcting and figuring out what the right deficit numbers are, because all of us here will agree that Mr. Chidambaram has done quite a bit of window dressing. Subsidies, no matter what we might think, reducing subsidies is contingent on negotiations and discussions with the states. So tough budget means what? What expenditure are you going to slash? What revenue are you going to increase? Is there any agreement about removal of all tax exemptions, as earlier someone talked about? So the best you can really hope for is a signal that one is going to return to fiscal consolidation. On the tax revenue, tax and expenditure part of it, that I think is the only thing you can hope for, and perhaps you can look for some means of divesting equity in public sector banks so that the recapitalization happens. The rest of it, whether it is direct, indirect, I think has to wait till next year.
Mr. Aga had a question for N.K. Singh, so let's draw Mr. Singh into this conversation as well.
Yes, if Mr. Singh is still there, I want to explain my question. One of the things that worries me about strong mandates is that with all good intentions and with all capable people, you start empowering ministers and ministries and PMOs, whereas if you try to look for India doing better not over the next 1 or 2 years but over the next 2 decades, what you really need and what we really miss is strong regulatory institutions, particularly or only in the infrastructure sectors. Most sophisticated economies have moved away from micromanagement by ministers because ministers come and go. Today you have a majority, your next government may be a minority government. And unless India is able to lift itself out from its minister, aviation minister deciding this and railway minister deciding that, unless we make our whole governance process a little more contemporary, which I am talking of getting top class regulatory institutions and protecting those we already have like the Reserve Bank, I'd like to hear Mr. N.K. Singh's view as he may be close to this kind of thinking conceptually.
Mr. Singh, you want to take that?
Well, I share the sentiment that you need to build institutions and you need to have foster regulatory institutions which are credible and which in a way firewalls decision making from political uncertainties. But having said that, let me also say that the regulatory culture in this country has yet to really settle down to levels which I would believe would optimize the benefits from independent regulatory structures. I mean, I was responsible in some ways for the new Electricity Act and the creation of the electricity regulator. But now I realize that the issues of selecting a proper regulator, terms and conditions of the regulator, issues of regulatory capture, particularly regulatory capture in the states, are those in which regulators are neither subjected to any kind of executive or parliamentary control, exercise enormous powers under powers which have been delegated to them without the checks and balances which a normal executive functioning has. So I think that in some cases the regulatory experiment, if I may say so, has not been particularly encouraging. Having said this, I agree that we need to balance out firewall executive decision making from the vagaries of political uncertainties by strengthening institutions. At the same time, we need to make sure that institutions which we create are institutions which are credible in terms of the manner of selection, terms and conditions of employment, and in terms of ensuring that regulatory capture does not take place in the manner where we get the worst of the two worlds.
Is there any chance of Narendra Modi, in a sense, coming out with something to thank the people, populist sops, if you will call it that, for this really landslide victory that he's seen today?
No, I think he has promised that he's not going to
He's
do
not
that.
going to do that, so there's absolutely no chance of that.
That I'm different.
Yeah.
But he will talk about development, he will talk about meeting aspirations, he will talk about the youth, the need to create jobs. He will say, you know, I have reached out to the people of India and they have listened to me. I am a chaiwala. I don't serve cappuccino like Sonia. You know, I am a man of the people have elected me, I'm going to work. But I'm not going to be an elitist who just gives away a few subsidies and then makes thousands of black money. I'm going to be a different kind of person.
We've got Rajat Rajgade also waiting with us, but before we go to him, closing comments from our panelists. Sadanand, you know, the one criticism of Modi is that he may not, he probably doesn't tolerate dissent. You know, his critics say that his style of functioning is authoritarian. He may not let his cabinet really have a significant say in policy making. It will be his way largely. How would you respond to that reading?
I mean, I think there's a certain amount of truth. This is clearly a strong leader. But I think a lot of this is overblown. I think that some of this really goes into paranoia and fear-mongering territory, the idea that this person is somehow going to make India less democratic, or there's not going to be room to criticize him and so on. I think that's simply not true. I think the larger economic question is simply this. Modi campaigned as a centrist. Will he govern as a rightist? So if you look at his campaign statements and his speeches, for example, he was very clear that he was not going to privatize. He was not against food security. He was mum on land acquisition. So there are a lot of things where Modi's supporters had views that were more to his right than the party's stated positions. Was that just a tactic? Hopefully that was just a tactic, and in reality he's going to govern to the right of where he campaigned from, because he certainly has a mandate that if he chooses to do that, he'll be able to achieve things.
Professor Debroy, briefly, what Narendra Modi can do and what he should do in the next 3 to 6 months?
Well, he said in his interviews and speeches that a government is for 5 years, and therefore one should not expect these kinds of 100-day agendas or 3 months or whatever. But like I said earlier, firstly, the administration is certain to be fixed, and secondly, there will be a clear focus on the center-state part of it.
Mr. Aga, let you have the last word. He's going to be judged. People are going to be judging him. When do you think we should realistically give him? How much grace period can we give Narendra Modi, given the kind of expectations that we have?
You know, I think he's deeply, deeply aware that he's going to be judged as a personality, as a leader. It's extraordinary. In fact, if you look at it, after Gandhi, Nehru, Indira and Rajiv, he's the first leader to have got all India support. Even J.P. Narayan didn't have it for any length of time. The burden on him is very high. I'm sure he's very deeply aware. He's been an angular personality, but he's also been calculating and adaptive.
Right.
And I think these things will help him. My feeling is that, as Deepak Parekh was alluding, you know, he's had a perspective which is a cleavage from the past, because so far we've had rulers who were either economists or finance ministers or sitting from Delhi, planning commission mindset. Now he's got a completely different, he's worked entirely in the state, and he will look for avenues, untapped avenues for change. Right. My guess is in the next 15 days you will find announcements of direction, and I think we must give him at least 3 months to see whether his direction is right, and a year to judge whether the acts are right, the follow-up is right.
A lot of hope and a lot of money, both are riding on Narendra Modi. Hopefully he won't disappoint all of those who voted for him, and of course the millions of investors who are cheering his landslide victory. Sanjeev Vaga, Swaminathan Aiyer, Professor Bibek Debroy, Sadanand, Dhume, thank you so much for joining us really and understand this landslide victory and its implication on markets and economy.